When British forces arrived in Afghanistan, it was supposed to be a straightforward operation. Stabilise the country, support reconstruction, and leave. Instead, British forces would remain on the ground for nearly 20 years. So how did this happen? How did an operation meant to bring security unravel into such a costly and violent conflict? By the turn of the century, Afghanistan had already experienced decades of conflict. Years of rival commanders competing for territory had created a fragile nation, and by 2001, the Taliban controlled the majority of the country. In this environment, the notorious terrorist organisation Al-Qaeda were able to thrive. The Taliban had been hosting Osama bin Laden and his organisation since 1996, but their ambitions reached far beyond Afghanistan's borders.
After the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Taliban refused to hand over the leaders of Al-Qaeda, who were responsible for planning the attacks while based in Afghanistan. On the 7th of October 2001, British troops joined a US-led coalition fighting alongside Afghan forces known as the Northern Alliance. Their aim was to dismantle Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime. Though Al-Qaeda's leader Osama bin Laden had managed to escape, the Taliban were driven out of power, and by December 2001, their oppressive regime came to an end. But for the troops on the ground and the people of Afghanistan, this was only the beginning. Afghanistan had entered a new chapter, and few could have imagined that international troops would stay for another 20 years.
International troops, including British personnel, remained in the country as part of the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF. Its mission was to provide security in Afghanistan's capital, Kabul, and support the newly formed transitional government. At the head of this government was Afghan politician Hamid Karzai, who was first selected by NATO in 2001 and then later through a Loya Gurja or Grand Council in 2002.
In 2004, NATO took command of ISAF and planned an expansion into southern Afghanistan, specifically the provinces of Helmand, Kandahar and Uruzgan. These provinces were strategically important because of their proximity to Pakistan, where many of the Taliban had fled.
Kandahar shares a border with Pakistan, which offered a route into the country for Taliban fighters and weapons. Canadian forces requested responsibility for Kandahar, and Dutch forces took on Uruzgan as the smaller of the three provinces. This left Britain with Helmand, a territory with which it had a history dating back to the Anglo-Afghan Wars of the 19th century. Helmand is the largest province in Afghanistan, covering around 10% of the country. Its vast desert and mountainous terrain is fairly inhospitable, so much of the population live on the irrigated land surrounding the Helmand River, which is used to cultivate crops and opium poppies.
Some commentators suggested that deploying to Helmand offered Britain an opportunity to restore its influence at a time when its forces in Iraq were struggling to contain an insurgency and civil order in the southeast of the country. But others inside and outside of government warned that sending troops to Helmand could backfire.
The final UK joint plan for Helmand aimed to strengthen civilian security, develop the economy, and support provincial governance following the removal of the Taliban in 2001. Meanwhile, construction began on the main British base in Helmand, Camp Bastion, located in the desert near Lashkar.
Camp Bastion would grow to become the largest operational British military base built since the Second World War. By 2012, the entire complex, also encompassing separate American and Afghan camps, housed nearly 30,000 people and covered 35 square kilometres, equivalent to the size of a small city. Camp Bastion had its own airport, state-of-the-art hospital, dining facilities, churches and a water bottling plant. This sign is from the main gate at Camp Bastion. It is still covered in the fine dust that was prevalent in the desert where the base was located. Neil Baldock was the warrant officer in charge of Joint Movement Squadron in 2014, and he salvaged this sign when British forces eventually withdrew from Helmand that October. The sign travelled with him to Kandahar before eventually finding its home here as part of IWM's collection.
By the time that UK forces were ready to deploy to Helmand, the political situation in Afghanistan had become more complex. Some former warlords had been given positions in Afghanistan's new government, and whilst these leaders were corrupt and deeply unpopular, they were able to maintain a kind of fragile peace. In April 2006, British forces deployed to Helmand for Operation Herrick 4 in relatively small numbers, totalling just over 3,000 personnel. The initial plan recommended concentrating British forces in a triangular area between Lashkargah, Gereshk and Camp Bastion. The idea was to build a secure zone where development projects could take root and gradually build local support. But it wasn't long before the delicate peace in the province fell apart. By the end of the summer, the Helmand plan was in tatters.
As Taliban had been returning to the province, small groups of British soldiers were sent to what became known as platoon houses in Sangin, Nowzad, Musakala and Kajaki to prevent districts being overrun by the Taliban. These lightly fortified and improvised bases came under intensive Taliban attacks. Supplies quickly ran low, and because of the intensity of the fighting, resupplies of ammunition, food and equipment were flown in by Chinook helicopter whenever it was safe for them to land.
Sangin District Centre was one of the main bases used by British troops in 2006 and on subsequent deployments. It saw some of the most sustained fighting in that summer, which was exacerbated by tribal tensions over land and political affiliations.
And the minute you went out the gate, and I'm not joking, you pull out the gate of the compound and you'd be in a firefight, start to finish. And we would just do a big fighting loop all the way around the DC, just to try and create a buffer. And I think the most we ever got it was maybe a 400 metre buffer around the DC. So we were under siege, like British forces were under siege.
On the 1st of July, Taliban fighters attempted to breach the British base at Sangin District Centre. They launched a rocket attack on the tower there, killing 3 people.
This T-shirt belonged to Ranger Robin McDowell of 1st Battalion, the Royal Irish Regiment. During their deployment, the battalion worked closely with 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, who got these T-shirts made for the tour, combining both units' cap badges. One morning at Sangin DC, McDowell was moving his belongings to another building and placed his bag outside. Seconds after stepping inside, a piercing explosion was heard. This T-shirt was in McDowell's bag at the time, which was shredded by the explosion. You can see the holes in the T-shirt here, left by shrapnel from the blast. British forces remained in Sangin until October 2010, handing over to the US. Almost 1/3 of all British fatalities in Afghanistan occurred in Sangin, where 106 British soldiers lost their lives.
In October 2006, Operation Herrick 5 aimed to adopt a more mobile war against the Taliban to avoid coming under attack in fixed positions. Herrick 6 then took yet another approach, launching a series of operations to push the Taliban back. But any gains from these operations were short-lived and troops quickly became overstretched. It was clear that military action alone could not bring security to Helmand. Something needed to change. In 2008, General Andrew Mackay introduced a new strategy to win local support. Continuous fighting was destroying civilian infrastructure and the Taliban were still returning. So British forces increased patrols and development projects to build trust amongst local communities in Helmand. Afghan interpreters worked alongside the British, providing a vital role to bridge the gap between the locals and ISAF. With reduced kinetic activity, intelligence gathering became more effective. Using methods such as surveillance balloons, drones, patrolling and communications with locals, a picture of Taliban movements was being built.
This commercially produced radio was used in Afghanistan to monitor Taliban communications. Afghan interpreters carried these devices to listen to and record insurgent communications in Pashto and pass on any intelligence to British troops. This particular radio came from Patrol Base Sparta and was brought back by Sergeant Alex Capsey of the Intelligence Corps when the base closed down in 2013.
Until now, most of Britain's focus had been on the Iraq War, but by 2009 they had effectively left Iraq, shifting the entire military effort to Afghanistan instead. Combined with the arrival of US Marines in the province, this gave ISAF the numbers to take key areas, deter insurgents from returning and create the conditions for development, a strategy known as clear, hold, build. However, the Taliban were changing their tactics too, moving from direct assaults on bases to the widespread use of improvised explosive devices, altering the nature of the conflict.
IEDs are homemade bombs often hidden underground or in walls. They are designed to detonate on a pressure plate when a person or vehicle presses on it, or remotely by command wire. The Taliban's use of IEDs in Helmand rose steadily from 2006 to 2008 and had a devastating impact. By 2009, IEDs were the leading cause of British casualties. In fact, 2009 would become the costliest year for British forces altogether, with 108 killed and another 157 seriously injured.
British forces operated out of static locations such as forward operating bases, patrol bases and checkpoints, and so when the Taliban started placing IEDs around these sites, British movement was heavily restricted. Each patrol had to progress slowly and carefully, with someone scanning the ground in front with a Valen metal detector to detect any hidden devices. This made the IED a tactically and psychologically effective weapon, dramatically slowing the UK's ability to move through and secure areas, and ultimately undermining the effort to provide security to local communities.
With the increased use of IEDs by the Taliban, procedures for evacuating casualties were strengthened, including the use of Chinook helicopters to transport medical emergency response teams. Technological developments were fast-tracked, leading to improvements in body armour and mine-protected vehicles. Amongst these was the Husky patrol vehicle, brought into service for this purpose. It has a powerful engine and four-wheel drive, allowing for manoeuvrability across the rough terrain. It is covered in external armour, and the V-shaped hull helps to deflect ballistic force and protect the crew and cargo inside. The Husky was used as a command vehicle at headquarters and for transporting personnel, food, water and ammunition. This Husky survived 3 separate IED incidents between 2010 and 2012, and remarkably, no one riding inside the vehicle sustained serious injuries during any of these attacks, a true testament to the effectiveness of the vehicle's design. However, the third explosion would be the one to finally take this extraordinary vehicle out of action. During Operation Herrick 16 in 2012, Sergeant Steve Evans was driving this Husky after handing over checkpoint Azmat to the Afghan local police, when suddenly Evans and his members of his platoon hit a command wire IED. The angled hull of the Husky pushed the IED explosive force out to the sides of the vehicle, causing this extensive front-end damage. After this third incident, it was withdrawn from service and arrived at IWM Duxford in 2015.
While British military operations as part of ISAF continue in Helmand, political discontent is brewing in the country as a whole. The presidential elections in August result in Hamid Karzai being re-elected, but with low voter turnout and evidence of electoral fraud. In 2010, Britain's commitment to Afghanistan reached its peak with 10,000 troops across the country. US President Obama ordered another surge in US forces, bringing the total number of NATO troops to 130,000. However, shortly after this surge, the US began planning to withdraw its forces from Afghanistan entirely. In November 2010, NATO announced its intentions to withdraw ISAF from the country, and ISAF heads of state, together with the Afghan government, signed an enduring partnership agreement aimed at securing Afghanistan's future. The following year, in May 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed by US forces in Pakistan. As bin Laden had been the primary reason for the US-led intervention 10 years prior, his death prompted the US to begin drawing down its forces. In 2012, ISAF followed suit, confirming that it would end combat operations by the end of 2014, bringing all British combat operations to a close as well.
Once Britain and America had confirmed their timeline for withdrawal, efforts to build and train Afghan's own armed forces were stepped up. The Afghan National Army was now 130,000 strong, with some units leading their own operations. Some training had already been done by UK forces, who were working and patrolling alongside Afghan forces. But in 2011, this cooperation became more challenging after an increase in green-on-blue insider attacks between Afghan forces and international troops mentoring them.
The Taliban also remained a significant threat to ISAF forces. In 2012, 15 heavily armed insurgents dressed in US Army uniform cut through the perimeter of Camp Bastion in an audacious attack. It resulted in 2 deaths, 17 serious injuries, and significant damage to aircraft and infrastructure. Such incidents formed part of a wider pattern of violence, during which civilian casualties were also increasing rapidly. In June 2013, the Afghan National Army assumed responsibility for all military and security operations. Camp Bastion, now the size of a city, was handed over along with all other bases in the region. After 13 years in Afghanistan, NATO officially ended its combat mission in December 2014. Some troops did remain as part of Operation Resolute Support, which continued to provide training to Afghan forces. In 2020, the Taliban, the US and the Afghan government signed a deal intended to lead to a permanent ceasefire. However, the Taliban continued their attacks and civilian casualties continued to grow. Despite this, the US followed through with its plan and announced that all remaining US troops would leave the country by the 11th of September 2021, 20 years after the 9/11 attacks.
As soon as US and NATO troops leave, the Taliban begin attacks on major towns and cities. By the 13th of August 2021, the city of Kandahar falls to the Taliban. Just 2 days later, President Ashraf Ghani flees the country and the Taliban enter the capital city of Kabul. Once again, international forces return, this time for the largest humanitarian aid operation since the Berlin airlift, called Operation Pitting, where over 15,000 people were evacuated to safety in 2 weeks. However, since 2021, the Taliban has reinstated an oppressive regime where human rights have been rolled back, with women being heavily oppressed and forced out of public life. We do not know what the future holds for Afghanistan.